Chapter 1. Meeting Rebekah Gould. In the tiny town of Melbourne, lost amidst the endless prairies of Kansas, a girl was born on April 28, 1982, who was destined to become a victim of a horrific crime. Rebekah Gould came into this world in a family that would soon fall apart due to a painful divorce. The girl, along with her 3 sisters, remained under the care of their mother, although they maintained a relationship with their father. The difficult family circumstances hardened Rebekah and further strengthened her bond with her sisters, especially with the youngest Danielle, who became her best friend. Seeking a better life and education, Rebekah decided to leave her hometown and move to Fayetteville, a much larger city in the neighboring state of Arkansas. There she enrolled in a community college and began to study diligently, combining her education with part-time jobs. The dream of a university degree inspired the girl to pursue her goal. Danielle moved to Fayetteville with her. The sisters settled in the same apartment, supporting each other. One time during a visit home, Rebekah met a guy named Casey. Sparks flew between them, and soon the couple began dating, despite the distance. Casey lived in Melbourne, so the girl often visited him, staying in the trailer he occupied on his parents' property. It seemed that despite some problems, Rebekah and Casey's relationship was quite harmonious. They spent weekends together, hung out with family, and made plans for the future. Nothing foreshadowed the trouble that would soon shatter all the girls' dreams and hopes. That September morning in 2004, Rebekah, as always, drove Casey to work at a fast food restaurant. She stopped to buy breakfast for herself and her boyfriend, then returned to the trailer, intending to get some more sleep after a sleepless night before heading back to Fayetteville. The girl didn't yet know that these last moments of peace would prove fatal for her and become a prelude to a terrible finale. Meanwhile, Danielle was waiting in vain for her sister, not suspecting that she would never return to pick her up. Only later would the younger sister become worried and start searching for Rebekah, hoping for the usual change of plans. However, she would soon have to face the horrifying reality. Rebekah had disappeared without a trace, and this would be the beginning of one of the most mysterious crimes in the history of their town. Chapter 2. Rebekah's Disappearance. Monday, September 20th, 2004, seemed like an ordinary day for the residents of Melbourne. Rebekah Gould, as usual, drove her boyfriend Casey to work at a fast food restaurant in the morning. On the way, she stopped at a local store where she bought coffee and a sandwich for breakfast. Upon returning to Casey's trailer, the girl decided to get some more sleep before heading to Fayetteville, as she hadn't been able to fall asleep the previous night due to some alarming premonitions. Meanwhile, Danielle, Rebekah's younger sister, was waiting for her at her boyfriend's house. The girls had agreed that Rebekah would pick her up after lunch, and they would go back to Fayetteville together, where they were studying at college. However, hours passed, and the older sister never showed up. At first, Danielle wasn't too worried, assuming that Rebekah's plans might have changed. Eventually, the girl made her own way to their parents' house, where she was to collect her things before leaving. But the next morning, Danielle's unease intensified. Rebekah still hadn't returned home, hadn't called or responded to any messages. The younger sister began frantically phoning anyone who might know of Rebekah's whereabouts. The first person she called was Casey. However, the guy assured her that he hadn't spent the night at home and had no idea where his girlfriend might be. He was convinced that Rebekah should have been in Fayetteville with her sister long ago. Danielle continued to call friends and acquaintances, but no one could shed light on Rebekah's mysterious disappearance. Finally, the girl decided to go to the police. She called the local sheriff's department and reported that her sister had been missing for almost 24 hours. This alarming call marked the beginning of an investigation that would later grow into one of the most confusing and horrific criminal cases in Melbourne's history. The police immediately began collecting information and questioning potential witnesses. The first person they decided to interrogate was Casey. After all, he was the last person to see Rebekah alive. The detectives visited the restaurant where the guy worked and began asking him uncomfortable questions. Casey repeated the same thing he had told Danielle. He had spent the night at a friend's house, and in the morning he went straight to work. assuming that Rebekah had left town with her sister long ago. Despite Casey having an alibi, the police felt some unease. It seemed strange that the guy had left his dog, which required constant attention, to fend for itself. Plus, there was always someone at Casey's parents' house to take care of the animal. So why did he decide to spend the night at a friend's place on the eve of his girlfriend's departure? These questions wouldn't leave the detectives alone. Having obtained permission from Casey, the police thoroughly examined the trailer where the guy lived and where Rebekah was last seen. The girl's car was parked in the yard, only heightening the alarm. Inside the dwelling, there was a persistent smell of bleach, which had apparently been used to hide traces of some event. Rebekah's things, her purse, wallet, phone, and even her recently purchased breakfast, everything was in its place. The girl's dog, a small Pomeranian, wandered aimlessly around the unkempt room. The detective's attention was drawn to the bedroom. The bed was messily made, and the sheet was crumpled and overturned. Some of the bedding was found in the washing machine, with bloodstains on it. Under the mattress, even larger bloody stains were hidden. Someone had clearly tried to conceal the terrible consequences of what had happened in that room. Forensic analysis confirmed the worst fears. The blood belonged to Rebekah. Suspicion instantly fell on Casey. The amount of blood found indicated that a brutal murder had taken place in the trailer. However, the guy had an ironclad alibi. Several witnesses had seen Rebekah personally drive him to work on Monday morning, and then, between 8:30 and 4:30, Casey had been constantly present at the restaurant. Security cameras recorded his friends picking him up in a car after his shift ended, and then the company headed to the movies, as evidenced by surveillance footage at the cinema and store receipts. It seemed that Casey had a perfect alibi for the time of Rebekah's disappearance and probable murder. However, the police could not dismiss him as a suspect. Everything they had seen in the trailer seemed too strange and eerie. Many questions remained. If Casey was innocent, then who attacked Rebekah? Why were her things left undamaged? Where did the perpetrator go, and where was the girl's body? The investigators felt that the key to unraveling this sinister mystery was somewhere very close. They didn't yet realize that the answers to all the questions would turn out to be far more terrible than they could have imagined. And Melbourne would soon shudder at the news of one of the bloodiest and most mysterious murders in the town's history. Chapter 3: The Murder Investigation. A week had passed since Rebekah Gould's disappearance, and the police were still wandering in a maze of versions and assumptions. It seemed that every new lead only led the investigation to a dead end. But on one gloomy September day, the 27th, shocking news came in that stunned all the residents of Melbourne. A passerby had stumbled upon the body of a young girl, brutally mutilated and carelessly thrown to the bottom of a shallow ravine outside the city. The police immediately rushed to the scene of the gruesome find. Experts thoroughly examined the area in search of traces and physical evidence. Despite significant damage, identifying the murdered girl as Rebekah Gould was not difficult. She was still wearing the same t-shirt and underwear she was last seen in alive. A subsequent autopsy showed that death had occurred approximately 7 days earlier, that is, on the same Monday, September 20th, when Rebekah drove Casey to work and then disappeared forever. The coroner found signs of a brutal beating on the girl's body, numerous bruises, a broken nose, and a fractured skull. Particularly striking were 2 wounds from powerful blows to the head with a blunt object. Apparently they were the fatal ones. The shape of these injuries amazingly coincided with the outlines of the missing leg from the piano that stood in Casey's trailer. The police suggested that it could have been used as a murder weapon, but the leg itself was nowhere to be found nearby. Other autopsy details also testified to the shocking brutality of the killer. In addition to the head injuries, Rebekah's neck showed characteristic signs of strangulation. A broken hyoid bone indicated prolonged and merciless squeezing of the throat. At the same time, the girl had no traces of struggle or self-defense, which meant that the attacker was most likely well known to her and struck from behind. The absence of signs of sexual violence also suggested that rape was unlikely to be the motive for the murder. Meanwhile, the detectives continued to dig under Casey. Several witnesses recalled hearing from Rebekah about her desire to break up with the guy, allegedly because she was fed up with the constant quarrels and accusations. Casey's excessive possessiveness was becoming increasingly apparent, especially after Rebekah's move to another city for her studies. However, the impeccability of his alibi forced the police to look for other leads and potential suspects. One such person was Justin, the victim's ex-boyfriend. Rumor had it that he and Rebekah had had a falling out at one point, so the investigators decided to check whether the jealous ex could have been the cause of the tragedy. But after talking to Justin, this version had to be discarded. The guy convincingly proved that he had long ceased any relationship with Rebekah and did not even know about her return to Melbourne. Another suspicious character turned out to be JB, a small-time drug dealer from whom Rebekah occasionally bought marijuana. The day before her disappearance, the girl had taken $20 worth of weed from him, but never paid up. However, after talking to JB, the police realized that this guy, although not a model of law abidance, was unlikely to kill a debtor over some $20. Moreover, he successfully passed a polygraph test. Later, the list of potential suspects included Chris Cantrell, a local resident who, according to rumors, had allegedly boasted about killing Rebekah. At least that's what several witnesses claimed. But during interrogation, Chris firmly denied these accusations and claimed that he was simply misunderstood. No other evidence was found against him. Plus, the guy had a reliable alibi for the time of the murder. Thus, one by one, all the leads and clues collapsed like a house of cards. The investigation stubbornly refused to budge, despite the desperate efforts of detectives and incessant public pressure demanding the punishment of Rebekah's killer. It seemed that years would pass before the case moved forward. The girl's confused and perplexed parents could not come to terms with this state of affairs. They constantly called the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, demanded the disclosure of the case files. The police invariably responded with a refusal, citing the secrecy of the pre-trial investigation. Then, the desperate couple hired a private detective, hoping that at least he would be able to shed light on the mysterious death of their daughter. But even that yielded no results. In desperation, the family put up a $25,000 reward for any information that would help find the killer. It would seem that a decent amount should prompt people to remember or report something important. But weeks and months passed, and not a single witness came forward. The Rebekah Gould case was gradually gathering dust on police shelves, turning into another death case. It wasn't until the late 2010s that an unexpected breakthrough occurred. It came in the form of a series of podcasts dedicated to the unsolved murder of the girl from Melbourne. Journalists interviewed Rebekah's friends, relatives, and acquaintances, reconstructed the chronology of events, dug up old newspaper clippings in search of at least some clue. It seemed that these programs were doomed to remain just a reconstruction of a long-forgotten tragedy, when suddenly a new witness unexpectedly spoke up, and his testimony was about to fundamentally change the course of the investigation. Chapter 4. Reopening the case. When it seemed that the Rebekah Gould case would forever remain unsolved, an unexpected turn of events brought a glimmer of hope. One of the podcasts dedicated to this tragedy attracted the attention of a man who claimed to have valuable information. This anonymous witness dared to call the police and tell about a confession he had heard, which could shed light on the mystery of the girl's death. According to the man, several years ago, he had worked together with Casey, the victim's boyfriend. Once, after a few drinks, Casey had allegedly blurted out that it was he who killed Rebekah. The witness did not immediately believe the seriousness of these words, attributing them to drunken fantasies. But later, having learned the details of the case from the podcast, the man decided that he could not remain silent. The detectives working on the case initially treated this statement with skepticism. Firstly, many years had passed. Memories could have faded or become distorted. Secondly, at the time of the alleged confession, both men were under the influence of alcohol. But what was most alarming was that during all this time, the witness had never mentioned this conversation and had not contacted law enforcement. Why did he decide to speak up only now? It soon became known that the relationship between the witness and Casey was far from friendly. It turned out that Casey had recently started an affair with the wife of his former co-worker. It was quite possible that the story with the confession was just a way to take revenge, to slander a rival and create problems for him with the law. Or maybe, on the contrary, alcohol had loosened Casey's tongue and he really blurted out too much. Investigators understood that either of these versions could prove to be true. Despite all the doubts, the police could not simply dismiss this testimony. The accusations were too serious. The opportunity to finally unravel the tangle of mysteries surrounding Rebekah Gould's death was too tempting. So the detectives took up the old case again, hoping to find at least some clues that would confirm or refute the words of the unexpected witness. More than 1 month of painstaking work passed. The investigators re-interviewed the relatives, friends, and neighbors of the deceased and her boyfriend. They closely examined the testimonies, collected statements, checked alibis, but each time they returned to the same starting point. There was not enough evidence against Casey, and his alibi for the day of the murder seemed unshakable. And yet, intuition told experienced operatives that the solution was somewhere nearby. They felt that only one decisive element was needed to put the puzzle together and put a final dot in this drama. It only remained to find it. Later, the detectives decided to focus on a different direction. They began to carefully study everyone who somehow crossed paths with Rebekah and Casey in the period leading up to the murder. Particular attention was drawn to information about the visit of William Miller, Casey's cousin, who had briefly come to town just before the girl's disappearance. At the time of the tragedy, the investigators had already spoken with William, but then he seemed only an episodic character, not worthy of close attention. The man said that he had simply been passing by his relative's house when he saw Casey and stopped to say hello. Nothing strange or suspicious. However, now, as detectives set about reconstructing events by the minute, William's role began to take on new colors. Primarily because, shortly after Rebekah's murder, he left the United States forever and moved as far as the Philippines. Such a sharp distancing from family and familiar life seemed at least strange. Unfortunately, William's geographic location made it impossible to interrogate him. The Philippines did not have relevant extradition treaties with the United States, so bringing the suspect to Kansas for investigative actions was unrealistic. All that remained was to hope that William himself would dare to come to his homeland and fall into the field of view of law enforcement officers. While detectives were trying to find Casey's missing relative, interesting things began to happen in the virtual space. Several journalists who were working on the Rebekah Gould case created a group on social networks to discuss the progress of the investigation. Anyone who could and wanted to share memories, theories, or guesses about this crime was welcome to join. Unexpectedly for everyone, none other than William Miller himself joined the group. He began actively commenting on posts, sharing details that were not known to the general public. The man described the area where the mutilated body was found with amazing accuracy, although officially this information had never been disclosed. William also put forward his own versions about the identity of the killer, stubbornly insisting that his cousin's neighbors were involved in what happened and Casey himself was innocent. Such behavior could not but arouse suspicion. Why would a person who had been living on the other side of the world for many years suddenly immerse himself in the details of a long-past tragedy? Moreover, William's familiarity with the intricacies of the investigation bordered on the amazing. Eventually, one of the group members, a girl geologist, managed to establish family ties between William and Casey. This news stunned the community and forced them to look at the strange Filipino in a completely different light. Soon the police were informed about the suspicious visitor for the second time. Investigators finally realized that William Miller might be much more entangled in this story than it seemed at first glance. The problem was that the suspect was out of reach, thousands of miles from the scene. All that remained was to hope for a miracle or an amazing coincidence. And that miracle happened. In October 2020, 16 years after the murder of Rebekah Gould, William Miller returned to the United States. He flew to Kansas to visit his mother, who had recently moved to that state. Airport employees promptly identified him and notified the police of the arrival of the long-awaited guest. At last, the detectives had a chance to ask the man some very uncomfortable questions. Chapter 5. The Interrogation of William Miller. William Miller unhurriedly walked through the corridors of the police station, trying to keep an impassive expression on his face. Inside, he was torn by completely opposite feelings. On the one hand, annoyance at the forced visit. On the other hand, barely restrained delight that he finally had the opportunity to talk to the investigators. William knew for certain that without his participation, they would never be able to unravel this mysterious tangle. It had been 16 years since William was last in his homeland. Life had thrown him first to Equatorial Guinea, where the man worked for an oil company, and then to the Philippines. There he settled for a long time, bought a spacious estate, married a local woman, and had 2 children. Everything was going as well as possible, but despite the idyllic picture, something invisibly pulled William back to the States. Perhaps it was the desire to see relatives, or perhaps something much darker and deeper. The investigators greeted the guest cordially, albeit with barely concealed wariness. They understood that before them was a potentially key figure in the case, a person who could shed light on the long-standing mystery. At the same time, the cops could not help but notice William's strange, almost morbid interest in the progress of the investigation. No wonder he had been so actively commenting on the details of the crime in the thematic group, pondering possible versions as if he knew something that others did not. However, despite all the suspicions, the police had to play by the rules. After all, formally, William was still only a witness, albeit an extremely important one. So the conversation had to start as carefully and unobtrusively as possible, so as not to startle the interlocutor. Investigators were hoping that the man would give himself away, get tangled up in contradictions, or inadvertently blurt out something crucial. Therefore, at the beginning of the conversation, the detectives focused on seemingly innocent topics. They asked about life in the Philippines, inquired about family and work. William spoke about his wealth with undisguised pride. He said he had a huge farm, 12 hectares of land, a whole household with domestic animals. Along the way, the man let slip that only his elder son spoke English, while his younger daughter knew only her mother's native language, Bisaya. Later, the conversation turned to the events of 16 years ago. The investigators tried to recreate the chronology of William's movements and activities during that period. He willingly shared his memories. His mother was just about to move from Arkansas to Texas, and William, as a loving son, volunteered to help. At that time, he just had a 10-day vacation, so he was able to drive a truck and personally supervise the process. Miller did not hide that he had met with his cousin Casey at the time. According to him, they were not close, but they crossed paths from time to time. They were relatives, after all. Sometimes William would visit his brother's trailer, staying overnight if the opportunity presented itself, but he categorically denied seeing Casey on the eve of Rebekah's disappearance. The detectives waited for William to start talking about the girl himself, and their patience was rewarded. As if in passing, the man let slip that he had once witnessed a quarrel between his cousin and his girlfriend. Allegedly, the conflict seemed quite serious to him and even scared him a little. So emotional were both lovers. After that, William reluctantly added that he never saw Rebekah again, either alive or dead. This phrase became a real gift for the police. They grabbed onto it like a lifeline. After all, until now, no one had said a word about the girl's death. Even more so, the investigators deliberately did not inform Miller that they had found a mutilated body so as not to reveal all their cards. And now their suspect himself was talking about Rebekah's death, although from his words, it seemed that William Miller had driven himself into a corner. His careless remark that he had never seen Rebekah dead aroused quite legitimate suspicions in the police. After all, officially, information about the discovery of the girl's body was not disclosed. At least that's what the investigators claimed. So how could William have known about her death if he was not involved in the crime? However, experienced cops understood that one slip of the tongue was not enough to bring charges. More weighty evidence was needed, physical or in the form of testimony. Therefore, they decided to resort to a little trick. The investigators brought several photographs of the car that belonged to William in 2004 into the interrogation room, and then, with an impassive look, they stated that traces of blood were found on the gas pedal in the cabin, which according to DNA matched the blood of Rebekah Gould. Hearing this, Miller noticeably became nervous. He began to get confused in his testimony, contradict himself, come up with some implausible versions of events. At one point, he claimed that he had seen a stranger in a white van near Casey's trailer, who was supposedly the real killer. Then he argued that he had accidentally witnessed a robbery, and when he ran inside to stop the criminals, he saw a bloody bed. These bizarre and sometimes downright absurd stories only reinforced the impression that William had something to hide. Eventually, the man, driven to despair, stated that he was ready to tell the whole truth. And this truth turned out to be strikingly eerie. According to William, on the morning of September 20th, 2004, he went hunting. On the way, he decided to stop by his brother's trailer to borrow a mobile phone. Rebekah, who was inside at the time, sensed no danger and readily opened the door to her boyfriend's relative. And here Miller seemed to be replaced. He pounced on the girl, knocked her down, and then began to beat her with his fists and improvised objects with all his might. Intoxicated with bloodlust, William grabbed a broken leg from the piano and began pounding the defenseless victim on the head with it. To finally make sure that Rebekah was dead, the attacker strangled her with tights he found in the room. Everything that happened next, William recounted with embarrassing calmness, as if it were something mundane. He wrapped the bloody body in a suitcase, wiped the floor of blood, stuffed the bedding into the washing machine, turned the mattress over to hide the traces of the massacre. Then he got behind the wheel of a pickup truck, took the unattractive cargo out of town, and threw it into the nearest ravine. On the way, he even drove past the police station, a kind of cheeky mockery of law enforcement. Having got rid of the body, he returned home, threw away the suitcase and the murder weapon, and he continued to live as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just cut short the life of a young girl. The investigators listened to this eerie confession, barely able to contain their disgust. They were haunted by one simple question: why? What had pushed this seemingly respectable family man to such a horrific crime? William swore up and down that he had no intention of raping Rebekah, that there was no romantic or sexual relationship between them. He had not robbed the girl, had no personal grievances or animosity towards her. According to him, it was a spontaneous attack of rage, a sudden outburst of aggression provoked by the victim's perceived vulnerability. Rebekah hadn't said anything offensive, hadn't done anything wrong. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigators were stunned by these confessions. Before them sat not just a suspect, but a real psychopath, a cold-blooded killer who had been waiting for the right opportunity for 16 years. No wonder William was so actively interested in the investigation. No wonder he returned to those gruesome events again and again, savoring the details. It seemed that all these years he had been mentally reliving what he had done, proud of his impunity, and mocking the police. Participation in the online group became a kind of game for him, an opportunity to prove his superiority over the law once again. But was Rebekah really his only victim? This question haunted the detectives. They decided to go all in and told William that they knew of other murders that followed a similar pattern. It was a ruse, a desperate bluff, but it worked. Hearing these words, Miller burst into tears and began to beg for mercy. And then he suddenly gave out a new batch of revelations that made the blood run cold. Chapter 6. Unmasking a Serial Killer.
From William Miller's words, it followed that he was not just a lone murderer, but a real serial maniac. According to the man's own confession, at least 5 lives had been lost at his hands, because that's how many bodies, according to him, were left dusted with earth in the forests and wastelands. The victims were mostly young women, mostly prostitutes and hitchhikers. William would pick them up on the highways, lure them to deserted places, and there he would give free rein to his perverse fantasies. He did not rape the unfortunate women, at least that's what he claimed. Instead, he got a perverse pleasure from the very process of killing. He watched as life slowly faded in the eyes of his captives, savoring their horror and despair. And then he would strangle them, usually with their own clothes, pantyhose, skirts, sweaters. The torture could last for hours because Miller was never in a hurry, waiting for the right moment.
No wonder he loved to hunt at night, on deserted highways, where no accidental witness would interfere. The police listened attentively to this eerie confession, feeling the blood run cold in their veins. They realized that they had stumbled upon perhaps the most terrifying find in the department's history, a real treasure for criminologists, a live serial killer, and such a talkative one at that. It's not just luck, it's an opportunity to solve dozens of crimes, to put an end to many years of hopeless searches. But was Miller sincere in his confessions? This question haunted the investigators. They were afraid that the maniac would deceive them, lead them into a reed thicket, force them to chase ghosts. After all, according to him, he never knew the real names of his victims, was not interested in their identities. He simply picked them up, used them, and threw them away, like rags, like broken dolls. So would he be able to point out the burial sites now in the heat of the moment, or at least describe the signs of the deceased? Would he want to? As it turned out, no. William readily talked about his own feelings, savoring the details of brutal reprisals, but as soon as it came to specifics, he immediately fell silent. Exact dates, addresses, car brands, all this was lost in the fog, either because of the long time that had passed or because of unwillingness to give out extra information. In the end, the investigators had to be content with an approximate map on which Miller marked several points, places where the remains of his victims could be found. And still, even this vague testimony was worth its weight in gold. The detectives knew that they had months, if not years, of painstaking work ahead of them, checking every mention, every clue, carefully sifting through long, cold traces, searching for lost bodies, matching DNA, identifying individuals. They understood that not all of Miller's crimes would be proven. The maniac turned out to be too cunning and cautious, but the main thing was that the monster would finally end up behind bars and would never again be able to turn someone's life into a hellish nightmare. And yet one case was proven 100%. The murder of Rebekah Gould. Miller gave away too many details that only the killer could know. He described in detail, step by step, where and how he beat the girl, what he strangled her with, where he put the body. He recalled all the physical evidence that he had so carefully concealed, the bloody bedding, the broken piano leg, the suitcase. His testimony perfectly matched the results of the examinations, the circumstances of the crime scene. It was impossible to deny. William Miller personally cut short the life of the young student and then led her relatives and the entire local police by the nose for 16 years. Chapter 7. Verdict and Consequences. 2 years after the arrest of William Miller, in November 2022, the long-awaited court session took place. The man appeared before a jury on charges of premeditated murder of Rebekah Gould. Investigators had failed to prove his involvement in other crimes. At least there was not enough evidence to bring formal charges. Therefore, they had to focus on the 16-year-old case. However, even one proven episode was more than enough for a severe sentence. Prosecutors insisted on life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. They argued that Miller was a non-human, a predator in human form, who posed a direct threat to society. Allegedly, if he were free even for a day, he would undoubtedly go hunting again. The defense, in turn,
insisted on recognizing the defendant as insane. The lawyers argued that their client was mentally ill and therefore could not be held responsible for his actions. They urged the jury to show mercy and give Miller a chance to be treated in an appropriate facility. In the end, after long debates and deliberations, the court found William Miller guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The man was sentenced to 40 years in prison with the right to parole no earlier than 25 years. At the time of his possible release, he would be 72, a respectable age even for the United States with its high life expectancy. This verdict came as a real shock to many residents of Melbourne. Some were openly outraged by the excessive leniency of the punishment. In the opinion of the townsfolk, such a monster deserved life without any buts. Some thought that the investigation had made concessions and drained the case so as not to spoil the clearance rates. After all, Miller's conviction automatically meant the removal of all suspicion from Casey, and it was him that many townspeople considered the real killer. But despite all the skepticism and discontent, the fact remained. One of the loudest and most mysterious murders in the history of Melbourne had finally been solved. The real criminal, a serial killer and psychopath, ended up behind bars. Maybe not for life, but long enough to protect society from new victims. And although not all the mysteries were unraveled, at least Rebekah Gould's relatives now knew the truth. They could finally exhale and begin to heal their emotional wounds. However, they still had a difficult path ahead of them. After all, the crime committed by Miller, like ripples on water, affected many people. Not only Rebekah's loved ones and friends, but also those who were suspected, interrogated, and accused over all these years. First of all, we are talking about Casey, the deceased's boyfriend, who was under the sights of the police and the public for so long. Now he was officially recognized as innocent. All charges were dropped. But would he ever be able to forget what he had experienced? Would he be able to erase from his memory the condemnation in the eyes of neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances? No less questions remained about Miller's other potential victims. Despite his confessions and promises to point to the graves, the case never reached real exhumations. No remains, no new evidence, at least officially. Does this mean that the maniac lied to gain the dubious fame of a legendary serial killer? Or maybe the police decided not to stir up long, dusty cases so as not to once again damage an already fragile reputation. In the end, strange as it may sound, many residents of Melbourne still consider William Miller an innocent victim. Allegedly, his confession is just a forced deception, an attempt to hide the real criminal. Allegedly, he took the blame for Casey, his own brother, sacrificed his own freedom for the sake of his family. It sounds noble, but too far-fetched, too naive. However, can you be surprised when rumors and gossip intervene in the matter? Miller's sentence, though not ideal, was at least an attempt to put an end to this grim story. It proved that even the most cunning and agile criminals sooner or later get their just desserts, that the truth, no matter how you mask and muffle it, always comes to the surface, and that for the evil done, you will always have to pay, if not before people, then at least before your own conscience. Epilogue. Several months had passed since William Miller was imprisoned. Life in Melbourne was slowly returning to its usual course. People worked, studied, loved, raised children. And yet, the invisible shadow of the past still hovered over the town, like an echo of the former horror that had sunk so deeply into the collective memory. Rebekah Gould's family tried to move on. Her mother found the strength to visit her daughter's grave for the first time in many years. Her father finally unpacked her childhood toys and photo albums hidden in the attic for so long. The sisters, who had grown up and flown around the world, now called each other more often, as if trying to make up for lost time, to share their pain. Casey, oddly enough, decided to stay in Melbourne. He felt he had to prove something, first of all to himself, to prove that he could build a new life despite the suffering and pain of loss he had experienced. Now the guy rarely visited the old trailer. The walls held too many painful memories. But when the opportunity presented itself, he would bring white roses to the doorstep, the flowers that Rebekah loved so much. As for William Miller, he seemed to have come to terms with his fate. In prison, he behaved quietly, trying not to attract undue attention. He willingly communicated with the assigned psychologist, willingly took the prescribed medications, and yet, occasionally a strange smile would flash across his face, as if a reflection of something dark, long buried under a mask of decency. It's scary to even imagine what could be hiding behind that smile. This story, despite its tragedy, became another proof of the inevitability of justice.
It may sometimes seem that evil is triumphant and criminals get away with it, but in reality, this is not the case. Sooner or later, but retribution will overtake everyone who has crossed the line of humanity, and then there will be no turning back. Only bitterness, loneliness, and the burden of guilt that will have to be carried until the end. I want to believe that the story of Rebekah Gould will serve as a warning to all of us, a reminder of how important it is to cherish each other, to value every moment lived next to loved ones, and most importantly, to always remain human, no matter what happens and what trials fall to our lot. Because this is what distinguishes us from the likes of William Miller, the ability to empathize, love, and forgive.